Welcome all of you. This is going to be the last discussion of the semester. Today I'll be talking about diaspora, diaspora literature and Anita and Me as a diasporic novel. I've already discussed the basics of postcolonialism in one of my earlier videos and also in my last class. So assuming that you all have understood or have the necessary understanding of postcolonialism, here I begin. We'll begin with the term diaspora. The word can be dated back to the time of Old Testament, where diaspora was used to signify scattering or dispersion of people who disobey God. It follows that diaspora comes with a kind of negative essence, for it suggests involuntary displacement and exile, though of course in its modern usage it's not always negative, but it always comes mingled with nostalgia. Now, etymologically, it's derived of the two words dia, meaning through or across, sparian, meaning sowing or scattering, and thus implies scattering of seeds. Historically, it refers to the exile of the Jews from their historic homeland. So, before we progress further in discussion, let's have a look at the definition of diaspora in its present usage. You can see in the screen the definition of diaspora. Diaspora is a social formation outside the nation of origin. It is a phenomenon involving uprooting, forced or voluntary, of a mass of people from homeland and their rerouting in the hostland or lands. Now, based on criteria, diaspora can be of many types. Say for instance, on the basis of time and formation, diasporas can be historical, as for instance the Jews diaspora, modern, say for instance Indian diaspora in England or Chinese diasporas in India, and incipient, implying diasporas that are still in its making stage. Again, on the basis of experience and profession, there can be victim diaspora, as for instance the Jews or the Tibetan diaspora, labor or proletarian diaspora, trade diaspora, that is the diaspora of Chinese or Japanese traders, etc. So now you can well understand diasporic experience cannot be homogenized. The experience of the immigrant in African diaspora in America will be different from the Indian diasporic subject in America. Again, their experiences will also largely depend on their economic status or professional affiliation. So now moving on to diaspora literature, it needs no clarification that diaspora literature is the literature written by the inhabitants of the diasporic space. The term identifies a work's distinctive geographic location. But diaspora literature may also be defined by its content regardless of where it was written. So now, since diaspora comes with uprooting, hence from this it follows in the diasporic space the subjects encounter a strong nostalgia for the land they have left behind. Secondly, on account of interaction with the dominant culture of the space, they tend to consciously or unconsciously acculturate or assimilate the dominant culture of the new space. Thus, diasporic literature traces a movement or displacement, presents collective memory, vision, myth about homeland, presents alienness felt by the diasporic subject in the hostland, presents the maintenance or restoration of the original homeland of the migrants, and also presents ethno-communal consciousness and solidarity emerging out of it, which is termed as co-responsibility. Now, if you think about a diasporic space deeply, it is the space of cultural interaction and negotiation, where primarily the dislocation or movement is of the inhabitants from the once colonized nation to the Western metropolis. Thus, the diasporic space is pregnant with possibilities, and in it can be traced post-colonial relationship. From this, the significance of diasporic space and diaspora literature can be deduced basically as the following. Firstly, the diasporic space carries theoretical dimension for it being the space of dislocation, nostalgia, and postcolonial relations, it paves the way for a rethinking of identity, binary, border, nation, homeland, etc. As for instance, diaspora literature presents narrative of acculturation and immigrant identity. Now, this acculturation can be referred to as both strategy and process, and it is indicative of the plan or method that individuals use in responding to stress-inducing new cultural context. And this is not a one-on-one process. But before reaching the dynamic end, the diasporic subject can pass through distinct phase or phases, say for instance assimilation, integration, separation, and marginalization. Secondly, diaspora literature fall under the broad category of postcolonial literature, for it traces a movement which enacts a reversal of the colonization practices. In case of colonization, the movement was from metropolis, that is Western metropolis, to the colonial periphery. But diasporic literature presents the movement from colonial periphery to metropolis. Thirdly, diaspora comes with its distinct feature, which is on account of the intersection of various dimensions like gender, race, economic status, religion that go on to form a diaspora. So diaspora literature aids to show how the distinguishing features of such cluster formation in the hostland happens. Fourthly, diaspora literature initiates the emergence of a new cultural synthesis having its own unique identity that could reflect the cultural signs and performances of both the homeland and hostland. Now, having discussed diaspora, let's move on to certain terms that are part and parcel of diasporic criticism. The first word is dual territoriality. Dual territoriality is indicative of the split and duality evolving out of the homeland-hostland, forming cohesive tensional entities. Thus, the diasporic subject lives without belonging in one and belonging without living in the other. This is particularly applicable to the first generation immigrants especially. The second word is ghetto spaces. Ghetto spaces refer to the spatio-cultural entity within the territory of the hostland which breed hostile mentality for the host country that can be traced to the lack of will or skill to adopt culture and language of the host country. The third word is the word that defines the diasporic space, that is hybrid space or hybridity. Hybrid space is the third space evolving out of acculturation and interculturalism in ethnically diverse societies, which is a distinct space where interdependence and mutual construction leads to the formation of a new cultural identity. This can also be linked to another word often used in diasporic criticism, and that is psychoterritories, which denotes the internal split notion of cultural identity delinked from the unitary understanding of homeland and hostland. So this is some of the terms that are important in diasporic criticism. Now we will move on to the final section of today's discussion, and that is discussing Anita and Me as a diasporic novel. The novel presents a picture of Indian diaspora in England with a 9-year-old daughter of the immigrant Indian family as the narrator. Now, firstly, the novel begins with a story of displacement where voluntary movement and heartbreak on account of leaving one's homeland initiates the story. The narrator begins the narration with lines such as this: windswept, bewildered parents in their dusty Indian village garb, standing in the open doorway of a 747, blinking back tears of gratitude and heartbreak as the fog cleared to reveal the sign they had been waiting for. Welcome to Britain. Here the words gratitude and heartbreak placed side by side presents the ambivalence experienced by the diasporic subject. Now, as the novel progresses, the readers become aware of the multiculturalism as well as the cultural conflict coming out of that. The dominant culture in Tollington is the white-skinned British natives. The interaction between the cultures as negotiation is evident in Meena's desire to have Anita as friend, the warmth that Mrs. Worrell radiates for Meena and her family, in the interracial marriage of Mr. Singh. Now, the cultural difference and conflicting positions are evident in the failure of understanding and through stereotypical representation that are embedded in the psyche of the inhabitants. Meena calls the Indian immigrants in England, whom she meets during the weekends, as uncle and aunt. Now, this is something which is very confusing to her English neighbors. So, in this context, she narrates an incident. She says, "I once tried explaining to our next door neighbor, Mrs. Worrell, why my parents seem to have so many siblings. It's just being polite, see? I said, like saying sir or madam to call them auntie and uncle. Mrs. Worrell listened and answered, 'You must be mad. What do you want more relatives for? You want extra? Take a few of mine.' Now, this incident shows the cultural difference as well as the gap in understanding that is present in the diasporic space. Stereotyping is a part and parcel of the Indian aunties' discussion on the white men and women outside in their ghetto space. Say for instance, Daljit, Meena's mom, says they have to mark out their territory. She doesn't complete like dogs, but the aunties understand. This kind of stereotype is actually a kind of resistance that the first generation immigrants show. Some other similar comments are, they expect their kids to leave home at 16 and if they don't, they ask for rent. Or they don't like bathing and when they do, they sit in their own dirty water instead of showering. And also, they treat their dogs like children, no, better than their children. Moreover, this is not one-sided. Say for instance, when Daljit's car moves backward on her way to Gurdwara, she being an amateur driver, to Meena's request, a sweet-faced elderly woman replies by using the phrase, "bloody stupid vogue." Meena, who belongs to the bridging generation, understands this clearly and also feels disillusioned in the latter part of the novel when Sam says to Uncle Alan regarding the latter's charity mission to Africa, "And give everything away to some darkies we have never met. We don't give a toss for anybody else. This is our patch, not some vogue's handout." So the relationship between first generation immigrants and the people of the dominant culture is a troubled one and filled with anxiety. Thus, to direct our attention to this fact, Meena says, "Scolding each other's kids was expected, a sign of affection almost, that you cared enough about them to administer a pinch or nudge now and then. But to be told off by a white person, especially a neighbor, that was not just misbehavior, that was letting down the whole Indian nation." So this kinds of feeling also make this space a very hypersensitive one. Thus, Meena's mother feels angry when Anita's mom names their dog Nigger. The difference also adds to the humor, the difference between the cultures also adds to the humor of the novel. Say for instance, due to the linguistic difference, Meena misunderstood the soothsayer's interjection of wo as an indication of constipation that she might have, for wo is the Punjabi euphemism for shit. The second generation of the immigrant family or the bridging generation is much more accommodating and reflects the hybridity that evolves out in a diasporic space. Thus, in the novel, Meena wants to be friend with Anita, and when for the first time Anita speaks with her, she is wonderstruck. She says, "It had been the first time Anita had ever talked to me, and I have wondered what I have done to deserve it." Moreover, unlike her father, she sings English songs better than the Indian songs. She also adopts ways and attitude of Anita and her kind and feels a kind of dislike for Baby and Pinky, Auntie Shaila's daughters. Though of course in the final part of the novel, Meena restores the balance necessary to survive in the diasporic culture and integrates both the cultures. Thinking in those lines, the novel can also be read as a Bildungsroman. Excluding these elements, the diasporic space also comes with a desire to belong, which may not manifest always but is located in the psyche somewhere. Thus, Meera says, if a brown or black face ever did appear on TV, it stopped us all in our track. "Daljit quick," Papa would call, and we would crowd round and coo over the walk-on in some detective series, some long-suffering actor in a gaudy costume with a goodness gracious me accent, and welcome him into our home like a long-lost relative. Last but not least, in importance is the element of nostalgia and recreation of home that happens in a diasporic space. And this recreation problematizes the physicality of home and nation. The nostalgia is portrayed through the emotional outbursts that Daljit has, and the phrase "bloody fed up" shoots from her mouth. The homeland is restored hence on the level of metaphors through food and performance. Meera speaks about food in the novel. Her mother used to come from her teaching job and would cook in the kitchen. Meera remarks about the food that her mother used to cook. This food was not just something to fill a hole. It was soul food. It was the food their faraway mothers made and came seasoned with memory and longing. This was the nearest they would get for many years to home. Through the weekend get-together also, they reenacted the familiarity and warmth of home. In those get-togethers, they found a safe haven. And thus, Meera says, I rarely rebelled openly against this communal policing. Firstly, because it somehow made me feel safe and wanted, and secondly, because I knew how intensely my parents valued these people they so readily renamed as family, faced with the loss of their own blood relations. Home also recurs through narration. Meera narrates how her mother, while doing the household chores, would begin a mantra about her ancestral home, about the flat-roofed house, old-fashioned pump under the mango tree, and Meera tries hard to imagine the same, imagine her parents' love story. So thus, Anita and Me as a diaspora novel presents the various dynamics at work in the diasporic space and traces the journey of the diasporic subjects through their interaction and negotiation with identity crisis, affiliation, homeland-hostland culture binary, nostalgia, and desire to belong. It's a semi-autobiographical novel for it's based on Syal's childhood in the mining village of Essington. Perhaps for this reason the description is so vivid. So this brings us to the ends of today's discussion. Hope you liked it. Thank you all for watching.